I still remember the dry heat of that Nevada morning when the car stopped in front of the hangar. The air smelled like hot metal and dust, and the horizon shimmered as if the desert itself was keeping secrets. I'd been through plenty of classified briefings before, but this was different. No insignias on the building, no familiar faces, just 2 armed guards who checked my credentials without a single word. When the gate slid open, I stepped into a world I wasn't ready for. The first thing they did was take my personal items, watch, wallet, even my pen. They handed me a badge with no name, just a number. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights as they led me down a narrow hallway. Every door we passed had thick security locks, and most had no labels at all. My escort stopped at the last door, looked at me, and said, "Inside. Don't speak unless spoken to." The room was cold, too cold for the desert outside. There were 6 people around the table, uniforms, suits, and one man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The projector clicked on, and that's when I saw it for the first time, the silhouette of the Blackbird. It looked unreal, like something drawn from the future, its long, sharp fuselage and wide delta wings casting an almost predatory shadow on the wall. "This aircraft doesn't exist," the man in the suit said flatly. "If you talk about it, you'll lose more than your job. You'll never speak to anyone again. Are we clear?" I nodded, keeping my voice steady. Inside, my mind was racing. I'd heard whispers for years, stories from other pilots about a plane that could outrun any missile, fly higher than any enemy could reach. But seeing it on that screen was something else entirely. It was real. And now, somehow, it was about to be part of my life. They started with the basics: altitude, speed, mission objectives. Numbers that didn't make sense. 85,000 feet. Mach 3.2 sustained. I'd flown fast jets before, but nothing like this. One of the engineers, a thin man with trembling hands, explained what that kind of heat did to the airframe, how the skin panels would expand during flight, how the fuel leaked on the ground because the tanks only sealed at speed. Then came the warnings. "You will be pushed to your limits," the colonel said, his eyes fixed on me. "This is not a training aircraft. It will not forgive mistakes. If you panic, if you freeze, you will die. And you'll take your RSO with you." I glanced at the man sitting across from me, the reconnaissance systems officer who'd been assigned as my partner. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just stared back like he was measuring whether I was worth trusting. The briefing lasted hours. Mission scenarios, emergency procedures, survival protocols if we ever had to eject over hostile territory. At one point, they showed footage of a Blackbird being tracked by surface-to-air missiles. The room went silent as the plume of smoke arced toward the aircraft, only to be left behind, unable to keep up. The message was clear: speed was our only defense. When the briefing ended, they handed me a thick binder stamped with "Top Secret, Do Not Copy" in red ink. One of the officers leaned close and said, "You've got one night to memorize the critical protocols. This doesn't leave the base. Tomorrow, we start simulations. 2 weeks from now, if you pass, you'll touch the sky in a way most people will never understand." Walking out of that room, I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders. The heat outside hit me like a wall, but I barely noticed. Somewhere inside that hangar was the machine they'd trusted me with, and I knew my life would never be the same. Later that evening, when I was alone in the small, windowless room they'd assigned me, I opened the binder. Page after page of technical jargon, emergency codes, and mission data. But it was the last page that stayed with me, a simple line in bold letters: "The mission always comes first." I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Blackbird's silhouette, black against the sunlit desert, waiting. They called it learning the beast, and I didn't understand why until I climbed into the cockpit for the first time. The State Route 71 wasn't like any aircraft I had flown before. It didn't feel like a machine built by men. It felt alive, unpredictable, and just as likely to kill you as to carry you to the edge of space. Training started before sunrise, every single day. The instructors drilled us on systems, procedures, and emergency protocols until the numbers were burned into my memory. I spent hours strapped into the simulator, my eyes fixed on gauges and dials, my ears filled with the sound of warnings and alarms. Fire in the left engine. Cabin pressure dropping. Hydraulic failure. They threw every nightmare at me, over and over, until I could respond without thinking. The first thing you learned was that the Blackbird demanded respect. At Mach 3, the smallest mistake could snowball in seconds. A slight delay adjusting the fuel flow, a hesitation on an emergency checklist, and you weren't coming back. The instructors didn't sugarcoat it. "This aircraft doesn't care who you are," one of them told me. "It will eat you alive if you let it." The suit was its own battle. They called it the pressure suit, but it felt more like a personal prison. Heavy, stiff, and suffocating. It took 2 technicians to help me get into it, sealing every zipper, checking every connection. The first time I put it on, I panicked. My breathing got shallow, my vision blurred, and I thought for a moment I wouldn't make it through training. One of the techs noticed and said calmly, "You've got to trust the suit. It'll keep you alive when nothing else can." Then there was the RSO, my reconnaissance systems officer. His name was Daniels, though everyone just called him Dan. He was quiet, methodical, and sharp as a razor. From the moment we were paired, the instructors drilled it into us: if you two don't trust each other completely, you're dead. Dan had been in the program longer than I had, and he carried himself with the kind of calm that only comes from flying on the edge for years. He didn't waste words. During those first days, most of what he said were corrections, sharp, precise, and impossible to ignore. "Don't chase the gauges," he told me in one simulator session. "Anticipate them. The plane's always 2 steps ahead of you. Stay ahead, or you'll never catch up." In the hangar, I got my first close look at the aircraft I'd soon be trusted with. Up close, the State Route 71 was even more intimidating than in the briefing photos. Its black skin absorbed light, the titanium panels fitted together like armor. There were no sharp seams, no wasted space. Even standing still, it looked fast. I remember resting my hand on the fuselage, feeling the cool metal under my glove, and thinking, this thing is going to take me places no one else has ever been. Flight physiology training was its own special kind of hell. They put us through decompression chambers, survival drills, and high-G centrifuge runs until my body felt like it had been wrung dry. I learned what it felt like to black out, how to fight the tunnel vision that crept in during high-stress moments. They taught us how to eject at altitude, what to expect when the suit pressurized in an emergency, and what it would feel like to hit the thin, cold air above 80,000 feet. One day during simulator training, everything went wrong. A simulated engine fire, followed by hydraulic failure, followed by depressurization. I froze. My hands hovered over the controls as alarms screamed in my headset. Dan's voice cut through the chaos, calm and sharp. "Checklist. Step 1. Right now." His voice snapped me back, and together we worked through the failure, just like we'd trained. When it was over, he looked at me and said, "Don't ever let the noise get to you. The second you do, you're done." By the second week, the aircraft stopped feeling like a stranger and started feeling like an adversary I could understand. I learned how the nose pitched slightly as we crossed Mach 2, how the temperature in the cockpit climbed despite the cooling systems, how the controls got heavier as the fuel burned down. Every little quirk was a lesson, and every lesson brought me a little closer to earning the right to fly her for real. At night, when the base went quiet, I'd lie in my quarters staring at the ceiling, running through checklists in my mind. Engine start, fuel management, emergency eject, bailout procedures. I rehearsed every scenario, over and over, until I could see it all with my eyes closed. Dan never said much about his past flights, but sometimes, when the instructors weren't around, he'd let something slip, a story about a missile lock that came too close, or a landing where the tires shredded from the heat. Each story ended the same way, with a quiet pause, as if he was remembering something he'd never quite escaped. The day before our first real flight, I walked into the hangar alone. The Blackbird was there, silent in the half-light, the crew already prepping her for the morning. I stood there for a long time, just looking at her. My hands were steady, but my stomach wasn't. I knew what the manual said, what the instructors drilled into us, but none of that prepared me for the reality of what we were about to do. As I turned to leave, Dan's voice came from behind me. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow, you'll meet her for real. And she'll decide if you're ready." That night, lying in bed, I didn't feel fear exactly. It was something deeper, a weight, an understanding that the Blackbird wasn't just an aircraft. She was a living, breathing force, and from the moment we left the ground, my life would never be the same. The morning of my first flight felt heavier than any mission I'd ever prepared for. The sun had barely broken the horizon over the desert, and the air was still cool, but my undershirt was already damp with sweat. I remember the walk to the hangar, how quiet everything seemed, how the crew avoided small talk. Everyone moved with purpose, like they knew what was at stake. The Blackbird sat there under the dim lights, black as a shadow, her skin glistening from the fuel that always leaked when she was on the ground. No other aircraft ever gave me that feeling. Standing beside her, I felt small, like I was about to climb onto the back of some enormous, sleeping animal that might wake up angry. Getting into the pressure suit was the first test of the morning. 2 technicians worked silently, sealing every zipper, locking every connection, checking every line for leaks. My helmet clicked into place, and the world outside dulled into a hollow echo. The suit wasn't comfortable, it never was, but once it was sealed, it felt like armor, like a reminder that you were about to do something no human body could survive on its own. The walk to the plane was surreal. The crew chief gave me a firm nod but said nothing. Dan was already in his suit, helmet tucked under his arm, his face calm as always. He gave me a look that said everything without words: focus, stay sharp, trust the training. Climbing the ladder into the cockpit was like stepping into another world. The space was tight, almost claustrophobic, the panels around me lit with gauges and switches I'd memorized over the past weeks. I strapped in, every motion automatic, my hands moving through the checklist while my heart pounded in my chest. Pre-flight complete, Dan's voice came through the comm, steady and calm. "Copy," I said, though my voice cracked more than I'd like to admit. When the engine started, the vibration rolled through my chest. The Blackbird didn't roar like other jets, it growled, deep and steady, like something alive. The crew moved away, giving us the signal, and the moment the brakes released, I felt it, the subtle push, the hunger in those engines as the aircraft started to roll down the taxiway. Takeoff was smooth, almost too smooth. The nose lifted, and the desert fell away beneath us. For a moment, I almost forgot to breathe, staring out at the rising horizon. Then, as the gear locked up, Dan's voice cut in, "Climb looks good. Level her out." And that's when I felt it, the first whisper of what Mach really means. The acceleration was nothing like a fighter jet. It wasn't a sharp punch, it was a relentless pull, steady and unyielding, as if the world itself was being left behind. The airspeed climbed, the altimeter spun, and my stomach dropped when I realized how quickly we were crossing thresholds that had always been theoretical to me. At 50,000 feet, the world below started to curve. The blue of the sky deepened into a shade I'd never seen before, so dark it almost looked black. My breathing slowed, not from calm but from awe. "Look at that," I muttered, forgetting the comms were live. "Eyes forward," Dan said sharply, but even through the comms, I could hear the edge of a smile in his voice. At Mach 2, the cockpit temperature began to climb, even with the cooling systems working. Sweat beaded under my helmet, and my gloves felt slick against the controls. The airframe started to hum, a low vibration that you could feel more than hear, and then, with a subtle shift, we crossed Mach 3. That's when it happened. Without warning, the left engine surged, a deep shudder that rattled through the entire aircraft. My heart jumped into my throat, and instinct screamed at me to pull back. Dan's voice cut through the noise like a scalpel. "Stay on it. Don't fight her. Check inlet settings. Now." My hands moved faster than my mind, flipping switches, reading gauges, trusting the training that had been drilled into me for weeks. The shudder eased, the engine stabilized, and the Blackbird kept climbing like nothing had happened. "You just met the beast," Dan said quietly. "She likes to remind you who's in charge." By the time we leveled off at 80,000 feet, my adrenaline was still spiking. The world below didn't look real anymore. The land stretched out forever, a patchwork of muted colors, and the horizon curved so sharply that for a second I forgot I was still part of it. Up there, at the edge of space, it was just us, the aircraft, and the silence. The first run was short, a simple systems check, no mission objectives, just getting a feel for her. But every second burned into my memory. The controls felt heavier at that altitude, more deliberate, and every small adjustment carried a weight you couldn't appreciate from the simulator. On the way back, Dan's voice stayed calm and steady, guiding me through descent procedures, watching every gauge like a hawk. The desert came back into view, and for the first time since takeoff, I let myself believe we were going to bring her home in one piece. The landing was smooth, but when the wheels touched the runway, I felt my legs shaking. The aircraft rolled to a stop, the engines powered down, and the sudden silence felt deafening. When the canopy opened and the crew helped me out, the sunlight felt unreal, too bright, too ordinary for what we had just done. Dan climbed down after me, his face unreadable behind the dark visor. When he finally removed his helmet, he gave me a rare nod. "Not bad," he said. "Next time, it'll feel like flying." today, you just survived. That night, lying in my quarters, I replayed every moment over and over. The vibration of the engines, the darkness of the sky, the way the earth curved beneath us. But what stayed with me most wasn't the speed or the altitude, it was that moment when the engine surged and the aircraft reminded me that she didn't belong to me. She never would. The Blackbird wasn't just fast. She was alive. And that night, I understood the unspoken rule every pilot learns sooner or later: you didn't fly the State Route 71. You asked her to take you, and if she agreed, you hung on and hoped you were worthy. 2 weeks after my first flight, they told us we were ready. Simple run, the colonel said during the briefing, though nothing about it felt simple. Our target was a stretch of coastline halfway across the world, a place where we weren't supposed to be. The orders were clear: get in, collect the images, get out. No deviations, no mistakes. It sounded straightforward on paper. In reality, it was a tightrope walk over fire. The night before, I barely slept. Every checklist, every emergency procedure ran through my head in an endless loop. When dawn finally broke, the desert air was sharp and cold. The hangar doors slid open, and there she was, the Blackbird, silent under the lights, her skin still slick with the JP7 fuel leaking from the seams. It always amazed me how calm the crew looked. For them, it was just another day. For me, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to jump. The suit-up was muscle memory by then. The techs worked quickly, sealing every connection, checking every valve. I'd stopped fighting the weight and stiffness of the pressure suit, now it felt like part of me. Dan was already in his gear, running his own quiet routine. He didn't speak until we were strapped in and the canopy locked. "Clear skies," he said, his voice flat through the comms. It wasn't optimism. It was a reminder: no excuses. The engines came alive with that low, guttural growl that vibrated through the cockpit and into my bones. The crew signaled, we rolled down the taxiway, and for a moment, I let myself forget the nerves. The Blackbird had that effect: it demanded your full attention, and there was no room for fear once she started to move. Takeoff was clean, almost too clean. We climbed fast, the desert vanishing below us, and within minutes, we were punching through the thin, cold air above 50,000 feet. Dan worked through the systems check, his voice calm, methodical. Everything was green. No warnings. No anomalies. Then came the push. The acceleration was smooth, steady, relentless. Mach 2.5. Mach 3. The sky darkened to that impossible blue-black, and the curve of the earth sharpened below us. Up there, you could almost forget the world existed: no noise, no turbulence, just the hum of the engines and the faint hiss of the suit's oxygen flow. Crossing the first border was the moment it got real. Dan's voice broke the silence: "Crossing now. Cameras hot." I glanced at the radar: clean for now, but I knew that wouldn't last. We were ghosts up there, but ghosts still cast shadows, and sooner or later, someone would notice. 10 minutes into hostile airspace, the first warning tone hit my headset. A lock. I didn't need Dan to tell me what it was. Surface-to-air missile systems had seen us. "Stay on course," Dan said, his voice steady. "Speed is your shield. They can't catch what they can't reach." I kept my hands light on the controls, eyes sweeping the gauges. The aircraft was stable, engines running smooth, but my pulse was a drum in my ears. Down below, the missile crews were doing everything they could to swat us out of the sky, and all we could do was outrun their math. A second tone joined the first, then a third. Multiple locks now. Dan worked the systems, feeding me data, but the truth was simple: if we slowed down, even for a moment, we wouldn't be coming back. At Mach 3.2, time stopped making sense. The ground slid beneath us in a blur, coastlines and cities flashing by like faint smudges. Every few minutes, Dan confirmed imagery captures, his tone never changing. The man could have been reading grocery lists for all the emotion he showed. I envied him for that calm. Halfway through the run, one of the tones cut out. Then another. Whatever had tried to catch us was already too far behind, its systems blind to a target moving faster than anything they'd ever trained for. Only one tone remained, stubborn, tracking us longer than I liked, but even that faded as we crossed back over the line and into safer airspace. The exhale I let out was sharp and shaky, and Dan caught it. "Breathe," he said. "She did her job. So did you." The flight back felt longer, though the numbers on the gauges said otherwise. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving only exhaustion in its place. The Blackbird hummed steady, almost smug, like she knew she'd carried us through fire and brought us home. The landing was smooth, but I barely remember it. What I do remember is the moment the canopy opened, the rush of desert air flooding in, and the ground crew swarming the plane. Dan unstrapped first, climbed down, and didn't even look at me until his boots hit the concrete. When I followed, my legs were shaking so badly I almost missed the ladder rung. "You're still here," Dan said, pulling off his helmet. "That's what counts." The debriefing was clinical. Mission success. Imagery confirmed. Systems stable. The colonel said good work without looking up from the papers on his desk. By the time they dismissed us, the adrenaline had fully drained, leaving me feeling hollow and wired all at once. That night, lying in my bunk, I couldn't stop replaying the tones in my head, the sharp beeps that told me someone down there was trying to end us. It should have scared me more than it did. Instead, all I could think about was the way the Blackbird had carried us through it all, steady and unflinching, like she'd been built for nothing else. I realized then that the State Route 71 wasn't just an aircraft. She was a weapon, a promise, and a dare all in one. And for the first time, I understood why every pilot who'd ever flown her spoke about her like she was alive. That night, staring at the ceiling, I whispered the same quiet truth they all had learned before me: you don't command the Blackbird, you earn her trust, one mission at a time. By the time we'd flown half a dozen missions, the routine should have felt familiar. Pre-flight briefings, suit up, engine checks, systems green, takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, debrief. But the Blackbird had a way of reminding you that routine didn't exist at 85,000 feet. Every flight was different. Every flight carried its own edge. And it was on a clear morning over the Pacific that we found that edge and almost didn't come back from it. The mission was supposed to be straightforward, a long-range run to test new sensor calibrations. No hostile airspace this time, no missile locks, just speed, altitude, and data collection. Milk run, the colonel called it during the briefing. Dan didn't buy it. Neither did I. There was no such thing as a milk run in the State Route 71. The takeoff was clean. The engines sang the way they always did, that low, steady growl that settled into your chest. Climb out was smooth, and by the time we hit Mach 3, the sky was the deep blue-black I'd come to know as the Blackbird's domain. Everything looked perfect. We were halfway through the run, cruising steady, when the first hint of trouble came, a flicker on the left engine gauge, so quick I almost missed it. "Did you see that?" I asked. "Yeah," Dan said, his tone sharp but calm. "Could be a bad reading. Keep your eye on it." I wanted to believe it was just a glitch, but 10 minutes later, the warning light blinked again, longer this time, accompanied by a vibration I could feel through the pedals. Then it happened. The left engine coughed, a deep, sickening surge that sent the entire aircraft into a brief shudder. The nose pitched slightly, the gauges danced, and for the first time in my life, I felt the Blackbird hesitate, like she was deciding whether she wanted to keep flying. "Left inlet unstart," Dan snapped, already flipping switches. "Hold her steady, don't fight it." Training took over. My hands moved without thinking, adjusting the throttle, rebalancing the controls, watching the gauges as if my life depended on it, because it did. At Mach 3.2, even the smallest loss of control could send you into a tumble you'd never recover from. For a few terrifying seconds, the aircraft bucked like a wild animal, the horizon tilting hard left before I wrestled her back. My pulse was a hammer in my ears, but my voice stayed steady, almost mechanical, as I called out the readings. "Stabilizing," Dan said finally, his voice low. "She's holding. Keep it smooth." We stayed that way for what felt like an eternity, riding the edge of chaos, every vibration magnified in my mind. Slowly, cautiously, I brought the speed down, trimming her to something safer, something that didn't feel like it was seconds from ripping apart. The strange thing about fear at that altitude is how quiet it is. There's no panic, no shouting, just a cold clarity as you realize how little separates you from the void. When we finally leveled out, both engines steady, neither of us spoke for a while. The desert of the West Coast was coming into view, but I barely saw it. My gloves were soaked with sweat, and my jaw ached from how hard I'd been clenching it. "Next time," Dan said finally, breaking the silence, "don't wait on the indicators. Trust the vibration. You feel it before you see it." He wasn't criticizing. He was teaching. That was his way. And he was right. Up there, the plane speaks to you if you know how to listen. Back at the base, the debriefing was clinical. They said it was a minor inlet malfunction, something to be logged and addressed in maintenance. To me, there was nothing minor about it. For a few seconds out there, the Blackbird had reminded us how thin the line was between mastery and disaster. That night, lying in my bunk, I kept replaying the moment when the engine surged and the nose tilted. I could still feel the weightless drop in my stomach, the sickening sense that we'd crossed some invisible line the aircraft didn't want us to. It was in those hours, staring at the ceiling, that I began to understand what the veterans meant when they said the State Route 71 chooses her pilots. You could fly her by the book, memorize every checklist, anticipate every failure, and still she could turn on you without warning. And if you weren't ready, really ready, she'd take you down without hesitation. The next flight came 2 days later. I thought the nerves would eat me alive, but once I was strapped in and the engines roared, the fear faded into focus. Every vibration, every hum, every flicker on the gauges, I felt it all. And when we hit Mach 3 again, I realized something had changed. The Blackbird hadn't broken my confidence. She'd sharpened it. I wasn't trying to control her anymore. I was listening, responding, respecting her limits. Dan noticed it, too. When we touched down after that mission, he looked over as we climbed out and said, "Now you're starting to fly her." In the weeks that followed, the missions got longer, faster, riskier. We skimmed the edges of hostile airspace, danced along radar lines, and pushed the throttles until the cockpit trembled from the heat. Every time, I felt that same edge, the razor-thin line where speed, altitude, and physics blurred together. And every time we brought her home, I'd walk away with the same mix of exhaustion and awe, knowing we'd done something few people on Earth could ever understand. The State Route 71 wasn't just an aircraft. She was a living paradox, beautiful and brutal, predictable and untamed. And the more time I spent in her cockpit, the more I understood that flying her wasn't about conquering the machine. It was about learning to survive the privilege of being allowed to ride the edge of the impossible. It was supposed to be a clean run, no interceptions, no alerts, no surprises. Just a high-speed surveillance mission over the edge of restricted airspace, collecting data and slipping out before anyone even knew we'd been there. That was the plan. But plans don't mean much at 85,000 feet, and that night, the Blackbird taught us another hard lesson. We launched just before midnight. The base lights faded behind us as the afterburners kicked in, and soon the dark ocean stretched out like an endless sheet of glass. I always liked night flights. Up there, with the stars so close they looked sharp enough to cut, it felt like the whole world disappeared beneath you. The cockpit glow was dim, just enough to see the instruments, while the horizon vanished into black. Everything was smooth through climb-out and acceleration. Dan and I barely spoke, the way we always did when things were going right. At Mach 3.1, the aircraft felt alive under our hands, steady and perfect. The cameras were running, sensors green, systems nominal. We were ghosts, and we were good at it. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A faint blip on the radar screen that didn't belong there, too fast, too high to be commercial traffic, but not in any of the known corridors. "You see that?" I asked, tapping the display. Dan leaned forward, squinting. Could be a reflection. Or a glitch. Except it wasn't. The blip reappeared 2 minutes later, closer this time, almost matching our speed. No lock-on tone, no warning, just that silent little dot pacing us in the darkness. My throat went dry. Nothing could keep up with us up there, not fighters, not missiles, not even the systems that claimed they could. Nothing. "Confirm contact," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Dan's fingers flew over the controls, switching frequencies, checking our channels. Negative transponder. No ID. Nothing's talking. We should have turned. Protocol said abort if there was an unknown in our envelope. But we were deep into the run, minutes from completing the sweep, and neither of us wanted to be the crew that came home empty-handed because of a radar ghost. So we stayed. At Mach 3.2, the Blackbird roared silently through the night, and that blip stayed with us, always behind, always just out of reach. I told myself it was interference, maybe some ground-based echo. But deep down, I knew better. Then it moved. One moment it was trailing us. The next, it slid to our 9 o'clock position, impossibly fast, closing distance in a way that made no sense on any chart or gauge. "Jesus," Dan whispered. It was the first time I'd ever heard fear in his voice. I tightened my grip on the stick, every muscle locked. "Options?" None that don't get us killed, he said. For 10 full minutes, we flew like that, 2 men in a jet that shouldn't be chased, tracked by something that shouldn't exist. The blip danced around us, slipping in and out of the radar like it was playing a game. At one point, it shot ahead, right across our projected path, then disappeared entirely. Lost it, Dan muttered, scanning the instruments. I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice. We finished the data sweep in silence, every second stretching longer than the last, and began the long arc home. The return leg was quiet, the gauges steady, the sky empty. By the time we touched down, the radar incident almost felt like a bad dream. Almost. During debrief, we reported the anomaly, but the techs brushed it off. Atmospheric distortion, they said. Ghost returns. Happens more than you think. I didn't argue. Neither did Dan. But when the room cleared and we were alone, he turned to me and said, "That wasn't distortion. And you know it." I nodded. For days afterward, I replayed the flight in my head, trying to make sense of what we'd seen, or what had seen us. It didn't fit anything in the manual, anything in physics. Whatever it was, it had matched our altitude, our speed, and for a brief moment, outmaneuvered the fastest jet ever built. Weeks later, we ran into a crew that had flown a different corridor the same night. Over coffee in the hangar, one of them mentioned weird radar echoes on their flight. When I pressed, he shrugged it off, like it was nothing. But the look in his eyes told me he'd seen it too. After that, I started noticing a pattern. Quiet stories, always told in low voices, always dismissed as glitches or illusions. A blip here. A shadow there. Always when the Blackbird was high and fast, where nothing human should be able to follow. I never saw the ghost again, not like that night, but I never forgot it, either. Years later, long after my last flight, someone asked me what scared me most in the State Route 71. It wasn't the inlet on starts, or the heat, or the razor-thin edge of control. It was that night, over the Pacific, with a radar contact that wasn't supposed to exist keeping pace with us like we were standing still. Because in that moment, I understood something that no briefing, no checklist, no mission ever prepared me for. Up there, at the edge of the sky, we weren't the hunters. We were the ones being watched. The briefing was short, almost too short for what they were asking us to do. The coordinates were precise, the window narrow, and the risk high. Our job was simple on paper: get in, gather intelligence, and get out before anyone on the ground knew we'd been there. But flying the Blackbird over hostile territory was never simple. One mistake, 1 second too slow, and the sky could light up with radar locks and missile trails. Dan and I had done missions like this before, but this one felt different from the start. The target zone was deeper, farther than we'd ever flown without support. There would be no tankers on standby nearby, no second chances if anything went wrong. It was just us, the jet, and the endless sky. We launched just before dawn. The desert air was sharp and cold as the afterburners roared, pressing us into our seats. Climbing through 30,000 feet, I could already feel that familiar hum as the Blackbird began to settle into its element. At 80,000 feet, the horizon curved in every direction, the sky above us black and silent, the world below shrinking to a map we could fold in our hands. Crossing the border was always the moment when the air got heavier, even though you couldn't feel it in the cockpit. Dan's voice came over the intercom, calm but clipped. "We're hot now." Eyes open. The first radar sweep hit us 5 minutes later. Just a flash on the scope, nothing locked, but enough to remind us where we were. I adjusted the throttle, keeping our speed at Mach 3.2, not pushing the engines harder than necessary but ready if we needed to. The cameras clicked in rapid succession, gathering the images they'd sent us for. Roads, installations, airfields, every detail sharp and clear in the early morning light. From that altitude, the world looked peaceful, almost too still to believe that men down there were watching us, tracking us, maybe even cursing us. Then the tone changed. A sharp, steady ping filled the cockpit. "Radar lock." "Painted," Dan said, his voice tight. "SAM site, 2 o'clock. Range unknown." I eased the throttle forward. The Blackbird surged ahead, the engine screaming as we hit Mach 3.3, then 3.4. The jet shook just enough to remind me how thin the margin was at that speed. Another lock, this one from our left. Then another, directly behind. They had us. 3 sites tracking, Dan said. No launch indications yet. The ground below was invisible now, just a smear of gray and brown through the canopy, but I could feel their eyes, their systems locked on us, waiting for the moment to fire. "Hold it steady," Dan muttered. "If we're lucky, they'll blink first." Luck didn't last. The missile warning tone screamed, sharp and urgent, cutting through every other sound. 1 launch. Then 2. Then 3. "They're up," Dan barked. "Climb now." I shoved the throttle forward and pitched the nose slightly up, feeling the jet strain as we punched higher into the edge of the atmosphere. Mach 3.5. Mach 3.6. The cockpit rattled, every panel humming like it might shake loose, but there was no choice. Speed was our only shield. "Missiles in the air," Dan said. 2 closing fast. Impact in 20 seconds. I forced myself to breathe, to keep the movements smooth, controlled. Overcorrecting at that speed could kill us faster than any missile. Then, just like that, the tone stopped. The missiles couldn't keep up. At that altitude, at that velocity, nothing could. "Lost them," Dan exhaled. "Clean sweep. No more tracks." For a moment, the cockpit was silent except for the steady roar of the engines and our own breathing. My gloves were slick inside, my pulse still hammering in my ears. We finished the run without another lock. The cameras kept rolling, collecting every frame of data they'd asked for, but my mind was already on the way out, on the long arc home, on the quiet stretch over friendly skies where I'd finally be able to unclench my jaw. When we crossed back over the line, Dan finally spoke, his voice flat but with that edge of adrenaline that never really fades. "That was close. Too close." "Yeah," I said, keeping my eyes forward. "But we made it." Back on the ground, the crew swarmed the jet, checking every panel, every system. The engines ticked as they cooled, the smell of scorched titanium sharp in the morning air. Inside the briefing room, the analysts were already poring over the data, their voices excited, urgent. For them, it was just another successful mission. For us, it was a reminder of how thin the line really was between coming home and vanishing into the black. That night, after the debrief and the endless forms, Dan and I sat in silence in the barracks, each of us replaying the mission in our heads. There were no jokes this time, no easy banter. Just the quiet understanding that we'd pushed the Blackbird, and ourselves, to the very edge and somehow walked away. Years later, people would ask me what it felt like, to be untouchable at Mach 3, to know nothing could catch you. I never told them the truth, that you're never really untouchable, not when you're over enemy lines. Because up there, speed isn't invincibility. It's just the thinnest layer of safety between you and the kind of silence that never ends. There's a moment, right before you think you're about to die, when everything becomes crystal clear. I'd heard other pilots talk about it before, but I never really understood what they meant until that night. The mission was supposed to be routine, if you could call flying a titanium bullet at Mach 3 over hostile territory routine. But that night, the Blackbird reminded us who was really in control. We launched from Kadena just after sunset. The air was thick and heavy, the kind that clung to your flight suit and made every movement feel like work. My backseater, Dan, checked and rechecked the systems as I taxied to the runway. The controllers cleared us, and the engines roared to life, 2 blazing torches in the dark. As we lifted off, Okinawa disappeared beneath us, just a scattering of light swallowed by the endless black. By the time we climbed past 70,000 feet, the world below was nothing but a map, and the stars above us looked close enough to touch. There's nothing like that view, utter silence, the curve of the earth, the faint glow of the atmosphere. It's the kind of thing that makes you forget, for a second, that you're about to do something dangerous. The run itself started smoothly. We crossed the line, radar pings lighting up our scopes, but nothing aggressive. Dan called out the checkpoints as we collected the images and electronic data we'd been sent for. At Mach 3.2, we were untouchable, or so we thought. Halfway through the turn for home, a subtle vibration rattled through the cockpit. It wasn't much, just a tremor in the stick and a faint hum in the pedals, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. "Dan," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you feel that?" "Yeah," he replied, already checking the readouts. "Engine 2's showing a temp spike. Could be an airflow issue." That's the thing about the Blackbird, at those speeds, even the smallest hiccup can turn catastrophic in seconds. I eased the throttle back a hair, trying to stabilize the temps, but the vibration got worse. Then the warning lights lit up like a Christmas tree. "Unstart!" Dan shouted. If you've never felt a Blackbird unstart at Mach 3, you can't understand the violence of it. One engine loses its delicate balance of airflow, and suddenly the jet bucks like a wild animal, shoving you sideways in the seat. The shockwave tears through the fuselage, and the sound, my God, the sound, is like a bomb going off right next to your head. I fought the stick, wrestling the jet back under control as alarms screamed and the altimeter spun. We'd just dropped nearly 1,000 feet in seconds, and we were still bleeding altitude. Engine 2's offline, Dan said. Restart sequence engaged. Stay with it. I stayed with it. Hands steady, eyes on the instruments, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it through my helmet. At those speeds, with one engine out, the Blackbird isn't just sluggish, it's vulnerable. And we were still deep in hostile airspace. As if on cue, the radar warning receiver lit up. Multiple locks. They'd seen us slowing down. Tracking us, Dan muttered. They've got launch capability. We need that engine now. Seconds stretched into eternity as the restart sequence cycled. Finally, with a cough and a deep, guttural roar, Engine 2 came back to life. The jet steadied, the stick relaxed in my hands, and the vibration smoothed out. Engine stable, Dan said, relief thick in his voice. Punch it. Let's get the hell out of here. I didn't need to be told twice. The throttles went forward, and the Blackbird surged back toward Mach 3. The radar locks stayed with us for a while, taunting us, but no launches came. Maybe they hesitated, maybe they miscalculated, or maybe the Blackbird had just climbed back into its sweet spot too quickly. Either way, we were alive. The rest of the flight home was quiet, but not calm. Every creak of the fuselage, every flicker of a gauge had us on edge, waiting for something else to go wrong. When we finally touched down at Kadena, the ground crew swarmed the jet, their faces pale when they saw the stress lines along the nacelle of Engine 2. Inside the debriefing room, the analysts peppered us with questions, asking for every detail of the failure, every number, every second of telemetry. But my mind was still in the cockpit, replaying that violent lurch, the freefall, the awful moment when I thought we were done. Later, after the paperwork and the mandatory checkups, Dan and I sat in the dark outside the barracks. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much to say. We both knew how close we'd come. It wasn't until hours later, lying in my bunk, that it hit me. If the restart had failed, if the other engine had surged, if the SAM sights had been a little quicker, any one of a dozen tiny variables, and I wouldn't have been there to think about it. People used to tell me we were invincible up there, that nothing could touch the Blackbird. They were wrong. We weren't invincible. We were lucky. And that night, luck was the only reason I lived to fly her again. There are missions you never forget, not because of the danger, but because of what you bring back. This one wasn't the fastest run I'd flown, or the riskiest, but what we captured that day, even now, decades later, I can still see those images burned into my memory. It started with an unscheduled briefing in a secure room at Beale. No one smiled. No casual chatter. Just a heavy silence and a stack of sealed folders waiting on the conference table. When the colonel walked in, the room went still. He laid out the situation in clipped, precise language, unrest in a region we weren't even supposed to acknowledge, movements we officially weren't monitoring, and a list of coordinates that meant someone at the highest level wanted eyes on the ground. Priority 1, he said. No room for error. You bring back everything. By nightfall, my backseater, Harris, and I were strapping into the jet. The flight plan was tight, every turn calculated, every second accounted for. The Blackbird doesn't leave much room for improvisation, but that night, there would be none at all. Takeoff was smooth, the usual roar of the J-58S rattling through my bones as we clawed into the sky. Once we leveled out and hit cruise, that familiar stillness settled in. From 70,000 feet, the world below looks almost peaceful, like nothing bad could ever happen down there. But as we crossed into the designated zone, that illusion fell apart. Our cameras whirred to life, sweeping across coordinates like clockwork. Harris monitored the sensors, calling out adjustments while I held her steady at speed. The chatter from the ground picked up on our receivers, frantic radio bursts, scrambled commands. They knew we were up there, and they hated it, but at Mach 3, hate is all they could throw at us. Halfway through the second pass, Harris's voice broke the rhythm. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, his tone tight, almost disbelieving. "What is it?" "Target 4. Wilson, I don't even know how to describe this. It's big. And it's moving." I kept my eyes forward, trusting him to do his job. The data came in high-resolution images, thermal readings, signatures that didn't match anything in our library. The object, whatever it was, looked like a structure, but it wasn't stationary. It was being moved, carefully, through a heavily secured zone. "Command's gonna lose their minds over this," Harris muttered. We completed the passes, hit every coordinate, and then turned for home. The return flight felt longer than usual, the weight of what we'd seen settling into the cockpit like a third crew member. Neither of us said much, but we both knew those images would raise questions we weren't cleared to ask. Back at Beale, the ground crew handled the jet while security escorted us straight to debrief. Our tapes, cartridges, and data reels were sealed in black cases and whisked away. When we were finally called into the secure viewing room, a small group of analysts and officers were already waiting. The first set of images were routine, convoys, installations, radio towers. Then came the sequence from Target 4. The room went silent. Frame after frame showed the object, a massive, angular shape, hauled across a barren stretch of land by an array of heavy vehicles. It didn't look like anything we'd seen before. Not a missile, not an aircraft, not even close. "What the hell is that?" one of the analysts whispered. No one answered. The colonel leaned over the table, his face unreadable. "This doesn't leave this room," he said finally. "Not a word. Not to your families. Not to anyone." For weeks after, we heard nothing more. The mission was logged, the images classified at the highest level, and our names were buried under layers of restricted access. Even among the crews, whispers ran wild, speculation, theories, half-truths. Some thought it was a new weapons platform. Others believed it was something not built by us, or by anyone we knew. Harris and I didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. We'd both seen the same thing, and we both understood what it meant. There are parts of the job you'll never get answers for. You just fly the mission, bring back what they asked for, and keep your mouth shut. Years later, long after I'd hung up the flight suit, I saw a grainy photo in a book about declassified operations. It looked familiar, too familiar. Same desert, same scale, same strange geometry half covered under tarps. The caption claimed it was an early prototype for a stealth aircraft. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's just the story they settled on for the public. But every time I think about that night, about the way the analysts stared at those frames without speaking, I can't shake the feeling that what we brought back wasn't meant to be seen. Not by us, not by anyone. People ask me sometimes if I ever saw anything strange up there, something unexplained. I tell them the truth, I saw plenty of strange things. But the strangest thing of all wasn't in the sky. It was on the ground, moving slowly through a desert, caught by the cameras of a jet that was never supposed to exist, on a night we were never supposed to talk about. And to this day, every time I close my eyes, I still see it, frozen in that perfect, impossible clarity, locked forever in those classified images. There's a kind of quiet that comes with flying the Blackbird, an odd, almost eerie silence when you're cruising above 70,000 feet at over Mach 3. The engines are roaring, the systems are humming, but in the cockpit, it feels almost still. On that night, though, that silence felt different. Heavy. Watching. Our mission was straightforward, or at least that's how they sold it. A high-speed reconnaissance run along a tense border, nothing we hadn't done a dozen times before. My RSO, Mitchell, and I had rehearsed the route so many times that we could have flown it in our sleep. No complications, no surprises. Or so we thought. Takeoff from Beale was smooth, the night air crisp and steady. The Blackbird came alive as we climbed, the engines settling into that familiar thunder that vibrated through our bones. Once we leveled out and hit speed, the earth below faded into a dark blur. The stars above looked close enough to touch. About an hour into the run, just as we approached the first set of coordinates, Mitchell's voice broke through the comm. "Contact," he said. His tone wasn't panicked, but it wasn't casual either. "Possible track. Bearing 270, high and fast." I frowned behind the visor. Nothing was supposed to be up there with us. At that altitude and speed, the sky is ours. I double-checked our systems, radar clean, no warnings, no locks. But Mitchell wasn't guessing, his instruments were picking up something we couldn't explain. "Maybe a glitch," I offered. But my gut told me otherwise. Minutes later, as we made our second pass, Mitchell spoke again. "It's back. Same vector. Closer this time." I tried to keep my focus on the flight path, but the unease was building. The Blackbird systems were some of the most advanced in the world, but they weren't perfect. Still, the odds of 2 identical glitches in less than 10 minutes? Too slim. Then, without warning, the cabin lights flickered, a quick pulse, almost like a power surge. The instruments reset for a split second, then stabilized. I glanced at Mitchell. He didn't say a word, just stared at the data coming through his displays. "You seeing this?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "It's pacing us. Altitude match. Speed match. No emissions I can track. At Mach 3, nothing keeps up. Nothing." But whatever this was, it was running parallel to us, just beyond visual range. "Command, this is Hound 2-1, I radioed. Do you have any traffic near Grid 4-5? Static." Then a clipped response, "Negative, 2-1. You are alone up there." I didn't press. There are times when you know you're on your own, and this was one of them. As we banked into the final leg of the mission, the feeling of being shadowed intensified. The instruments showed nothing definitive, just small anomalies, spikes in the readings, brief disturbances in the telemetry. It was like chasing a ghost, except this ghost was keeping perfect formation. Mitchell finally broke the silence. "If it wanted us, we'd know by now." I didn't answer. My hands stayed steady on the controls, but every sense was on edge. We powered through the final recon sweep, collected the images, and turned for home. For a few minutes, I almost convinced myself it was over. Then the Blackbird shuddered, just once, a brief vibration that rippled through the airframe. No alarms, no system faults, nothing the diagnostics could explain. But the timing was too precise, too deliberate. Whatever was out there, it wanted us to know it was still with us. The chase didn't end until we descended below 50,000 feet, well into friendly airspace. As suddenly as it began, the instruments cleared, the disturbances vanished, and the sky was ours again. We landed without incident. The ground crew swarmed the jet, oblivious to what had just happened. In the debrief, we reported the anomalies. The response was predictable, a few raised eyebrows, a note in the log, and a polite reminder to stick to confirmed data. But Mitchell and I knew what we felt. The silence, the pacing, the sense of being studied by something that didn't belong to us, or to anyone we knew. For weeks afterward, I replayed the flight in my head, trying to find a rational explanation. Atmospheric distortion, equipment malfunction, even fatigue. But deep down, I knew better. The Blackbird was built to outrun everything. And yet that night, something kept up. Years later, after the program was retired and the hangars were emptied, I'd sometimes drive out near the old runway at Beale. I'd watch the empty sky and think about that silent chase, about the thing we never saw but could feel, keeping pace just beyond reach. People like to think we owned the edge of the atmosphere back then, that nothing could touch us. I used to believe that too. But now, when I think back to that night, I'm not so sure. Because somewhere, high above a world that never even knew we were there, something flew with us, silent, patient, and faster than anything we had. They told me it would be a routine run. No speeches, no ceremony, just one more mission logged in the books. But when I walked across the tarmac toward the Blackbird that morning, I knew it wasn't just another flight. I could feel it in the weight of my helmet, in the sharp smell of JP7 fuel, in the way the crew avoided my eyes like they all knew something was ending. Mitchell was already strapped in when I climbed into the cockpit. He didn't say much, just gave me a nod and checked his instruments like he'd done 1,000 times before. We'd been through everything together, missions that tested our limits, close calls that we never talked about outside those hangars, but that day, there was a strange stillness between us. It wasn't awkward, just final. The engines roared to life, that familiar deep vibration that settled in my chest. As we taxied out, I glanced at the hangar doors. The ground crew lined up in silence, their faces unreadable. Some saluted, some just watched. It felt like a funeral nobody wanted to admit was happening. Once we were airborne, the Blackbird came alive like it always did. She climbed smooth and steady, cutting through the clouds with effortless precision. At 70,000 feet, the world below faded into a soft curve of blue and white. I'd seen that view more times than I could count, but that morning, it felt different, like I was trying to memorize every detail, every hue, every sound. Our route was simple, a high-altitude sweep across the edge of contested airspace. No threats, no interceptors, no games of cat and mouse. Just a clean run to remind the world that we were still up there, still watching. But in my gut, I knew it was the swan song. Mitchell broke the silence first. "Hard to believe, huh?" he said, his voice calm but softer than usual. "Yeah," I replied. "Feels like she knows." He asked, almost laughing. I smiled behind the visor. "You don't fly something this long and not think she's alive. She's earned that." For the next hour, we ran the mission like any other. Smooth, efficient, flawless. But somewhere deep down, I didn't want it to end. Every time I checked a gauge, every time I adjusted trim, it felt like I was trying to slow time. Then, halfway through the return leg, the radios crackled. Command gave us a simple confirmation: this would be it. No extensions, no reconsideration. By the time we touched down, the State Route 71 program would officially be over. Mitchell didn't respond. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say. As we began our descent, I looked out over the horizon. The Blackbird had carried us through everything: storms, missiles, mechanical failures, missions that were never meant to be spoken of. She'd never failed us. And now, as the air thickened and the roar of the engine softened, it felt like she was easing herself down for the last time, almost reluctant to let go. The landing was perfect, smooth enough to make the tower crew cheer over the comms. But as we rolled down the runway and the engines spooled down, a heavy silence settled in the cockpit. I unstrapped slowly, running my hand along the panel like I could somehow say thank you through the metal. When the canopy lifted, the California air rushed in, warm and sharp. The crew was waiting, but nobody said a word as we climbed down. Cameras clicked somewhere in the distance, but it all felt far away, like I was moving through someone else's memory. Mitchell and I stood side by side, watching as the ground team guided her back toward the hangar. The Blackbird's black skin shimmered in the sun, heat still radiating off her like a living thing. For the first time in years, I realized I didn't know what came next. Later, during the quiet of the debrief, I lingered in the ready room long after everyone else had left. The smell of coffee, the hum of the vending machines, the faint echo of laughter from the hangar, all of it felt suspended in time. That jet had been more than a machine. She had been a constant, a shield, a secret we shared with only a handful of people in the world. Weeks later, they towed her into the display hangar at the base. Fresh paint, polished panels, all dressed up like a museum piece. People would come and take pictures, point out her sharp nose and impossible curves, marvel at the numbers on the placard. But they'd never know what it felt like to sit in that cockpit, to ride the edge of the atmosphere at a speed that made the world below blur into abstraction. They'd never hear the subtle whine of the turbines just before takeoff, or the silence that followed the shockwave at Mach 3. Sometimes, late at night, I'd drive out to the perimeter fence and sit in my car, just staring at the hangar. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet you don't hear anymore. I'd close my eyes and let the memories come: missions over foreign skies, the smell of hot fuel, Mitchell's steady voice calling out headings, and the deep, steady hum of a jet that never let us down. The world moved on, like it always does. New tech, new programs, new toys that nobody talks about. But nothing ever matched her. The Blackbird was ahead of her time, maybe ahead of ours. And for a brief, impossible stretch of history, I had the honor of flying her. The last time I saw her, years later, she was sitting under a spotlight, polished and perfect, like she'd never flown a mile. People walked past her with their cameras and their kids, reading the plaque, shaking their heads in disbelief at the numbers. Mach 3.2. 85,000 feet. I wanted to tell them it wasn't just numbers. It was a feeling, a freedom, a quiet kind of defiance that no statistic could ever explain. I didn't say a word, though. I just stood there, hand resting on the cold metal, and let the memories flood back one last time. Because for all the records, for all the missions, for all the secrets buried in files that will never be unsealed, what I remember most is simple. The sky. The silence. And the Blackbird, cutting through it all, faster than anyone thought possible, carrying us higher than we had any right to be. The day after the Blackbird's final flight, the base felt hollow. The hangars were the same, the smell of JP-7 still clung to the air, and the distant line of other aircraft carried across the tarmac. But something was missing. It was like the heartbeat of the place had stopped. For weeks, I went through the motions. Morning briefings, simulator checks, small assignments to keep me engaged. But nothing filled the gap. There's a rhythm to flying the State Route 71, a tension, a focus, a quiet awareness that every second up there mattered. When that rhythm was gone, so was a part of me. I started noticing the silence at home, too. My wife would ask how my day went, and I'd answer with the same vague lines, "Fine, just busy." But what I meant was that I couldn't find a reason to talk. The Blackbird had been my life for so long that I didn't know how to be just a man sitting at a dinner table. Mitchell handled it differently. He buried himself in work, took on projects with other programs, spent nights in the office studying data on systems that were years away from being operational. We still grabbed coffee now and then, but our conversations were shorter. It was like neither of us wanted to admit that our best days were behind us. Months turned into years, and new aircraft rolled onto the scene. Sleeker designs, better stealth, more automation. Impressive machines, no doubt, but they lacked the soul. The Blackbird had something those others never would, a sense that you were part of something impossible, something that should not have worked but did because of the people who believed it could. I remember one afternoon, a young pilot fresh out of training cornered me in the briefing room. He'd heard the stories, of course. They all had. He wanted to know what it was like, really like, to sit in that cockpit, to watch the world curve beneath you, to hear nothing but the quiet hum of the jet slicing through the edge of the atmosphere. I told him the truth, it was lonely up there. Lonely and perfect. He didn't understand what I meant, not really. How could he? That kind of solitude doesn't exist anymore. The world is too connected now, too loud. Up there, it was just you, your RSO, and a machine that demanded everything but gave you something in return: silence, speed, and the kind of clarity you don't get anywhere else. Every now and then, I'd drive past the museum where she sat, polished and perfect under the lights. I'd park out back, away from the crowds, and just watch. People would file in, read the plaque, take their photos, and move on. None of them knew that the skin of that jet still held the heat of the skies we burned through, or that under those sleek panels were hand-fitted pieces that kept us alive against all odds. I'd sit there until the parking lot emptied, thinking about the nights when the engine shook the ground, when the hangar lights flickered off polished black skin, when we suited up knowing we were stepping into something no one else on Earth could understand. One night, I ran into an old crew chief in town. He'd aged, like we all had, but his eyes lit up when we started talking about the Blackbird. He told me something I'd never heard before, that on the morning of our last flight, some of the younger techs had slipped patches into the cockpit, a quiet goodbye from the people who kept her running. I never saw them. Maybe that's better. Maybe some things aren't meant to be found until years later. Retirement came and went, but the Blackbird never really left me. Sometimes, I'll be sitting in my backyard at night, staring up at the stars, and I'll swear I can still feel that hum in my bones. That quiet vibration that meant the engines were alive, that we were ready to push past the edge of what anyone thought was possible. There are whispers, of course. New projects, aircraft that make the Blackbird look slow by comparison. I've seen the streaks in the night sky that don't match any commercial flight path, heard the distant roars that vanish as quickly as they came. But whatever they're flying now, it's different. It's not ours. People sometimes ask if I miss it. I usually just smile and say, every day. But the truth is, it's more complicated than that. The Blackbird gave me more than I ever expected, a purpose, a brotherhood, 1,000 memories etched so deep I'll carry them to my last breath. But it also left me chasing something I'll never catch again. The world will remember the Blackbird for her numbers: Mach 3.2, 85,000 feet, records that stood for decades. But those numbers don't tell you what it felt like to trust your life to her, to climb into that cockpit knowing that every detail, every decision, every heartbeat mattered. I keep a single photo in my office. Not the official one they gave us at the retirement ceremony, not the staged shot with the perfect lighting. This one's different. It's grainy, taken by one of the ground crew, probably without permission. It shows her at dawn, the sun just catching the edge of her wings, steam rising from the concrete around her. She looks alive in that photo, like she's about to leap off the runway and disappear into the sky. Some nights, when the house is quiet, I pour myself a drink and look at that photo. And in those moments, I'm not an old man sitting in a chair. I'm back in that cockpit, helmet locked, gauges steady, Mitchell's voice calm in my headset. The engines build, the ground blurs, and then, just like that, we're gone. And for a few heartbeats, it's like nothing ever changed.